The Constitution of India ensures equality, freedom, justice, and dignity of all individuals and implicitly mandates an inclusive society for all, including persons with disabilities. And yet, a majority of persons with disabilities do not have equal opportunities in India and face several environmental and attitudinal barriers to education, employment, healthcare services, and so on. In this podcast, Kausumi Saha speaks to Nipun Malhotra, who was diagnosed with a condition called arthrogryposis soon after birth. Nipun is currently a disability rights activist and talks about his life, work, and his thoughts on disability policies in India.
So I'm sitting here with Mr. Nipun Malhotra. He is the CEO of Nipun Foundation, and I'm going to be speaking to him today about advocacy in the disability space. So, Mr. Malhotra, can I call you Nipun?
Yeah, sure. Please go ahead.
Okay. Nipun, can we start at the beginning? How would you describe your childhood experience as a person with disability going to an ordinary school? How inclusive was your school, both in terms of facilities available and the behavior of your parents, peers, and teachers?
So I was actually born in 1987, and India's first Disability Act, as you might know, the Persons with Disabilities Act, came up in 1995. So there was a lot of lack of sensitization and awareness about how to interact with persons with disabilities really when I was born. When I was taken out of my mother's womb, my arms and legs were fractured, and my parents obviously took me to doctors. Doctors did not know how to interact with a child with a disability. They told my parents that Nipun is going to live the life of a wooden doll. There was another doctor who told them that, well, it's worth keeping him alive because his neck is straight, but you should not really expect anything from him, and blah, blah, blah. Because even doctors, and this was pre-Google era, right? So my parents couldn't just Google that what is disability? Is disability ka kya matlab hota hai? How will it impact a person's life? But I think my life changed when there's this one doctor who told my mom that Nipun, even though he's disabled, will never deprive you of the joys of motherhood. And I think it's from that moment on that she took it on as a personal battle to give me a normal or ordinary life. And the first step towards that was sending me to an ordinary school. Now, many people, including people in my own extended family, were against me going to an ordinary school because they thought I will not be able to survive in an ordinary school. There were people in a social network who even said, why don't you homeschool him? Why would you send somebody that came outside? But I think both my mother and my father, both of them, I think, played an integral role here where they decided that if he wants to face a normal life later, it's better if he gets used to a normal life at this stage in his life. And thus started the journey towards going to a normal school. It wasn't easy. There were 15 to 20 schools that rejected me before one finally accepted me for what I could do and not what I could not do. This was in Bombay. I used to live in Bombay at that time. Mumbai now.
Yeah.
And that's how my school journey started really. Even teachers did not really know how to interact with a child with a disability. I had missed out on most of nursery and kindergarten and had gone straight into class 1. And it was tough for me because I was trying to cope up with 3 years of education in 1 year. But by the end of class 1, I started doing well, I remember. And my teacher called up my mom one day before the results and said, I want to meet you. And she thought that she's going to get a pat on the back because, well, Nipun has done well. But instead, when she went to school, the teacher said, I'm not going to promote Nipun because I cannot read his handwriting. And Mama actually had to tell her that, if you are not promoting him because you can't read his handwriting, it's better to keep him in class 1 for the rest of his life.
Yeah.
And sense prevailed, I was promoted to class 2 and so on and so forth. School life was both good and bad. Good because I think I got a trailer of what really normal or ordinary world is. But also slightly negative because I think children at that age are not really sensitive, and I think things have improved now. It was, in fact, worse at that particular point of time. I've gone through instances where children have tried to choke me by putting an eraser in my mouth. I've been socially ostracized. But what I also realized during my school life is that, if you really want to be in a position of power in society, you have to be somebody who is a giver rather than a taker. And I thought that the best way I can be a giver is that when friends are playing sports, cricket or football or singing songs, if I can, concentrate on academics during those extracurricular periods and start excelling in academics. And soon by class 6, class 7, class 8, I was topping the school consistently. And now things changed because earlier children were not inviting me to the birthday parties, they were not even talking to me, etc. Now children knew that, during the exams, हमें निपुण को phone करना पड़ेगा to solve our doubts, etc. And if you're not good to him throughout the year, he's not going to pick up a phone. So I think that's how my school life started changing, and eventually I topped the school in 10th by scoring 87%. In 12th, I topped the country in business studies, scoring 98 marks. So that's really a bit of my school journey.
So would you say that as a person with disability would always have to go that sort of extra mile just than say a person without a disability, an able-bodied person, just to be taken seriously?
I think this is something a lot of people with disabilities and their parents come to me also with this kind of a thing where, and I think it is sad that a person with a disability has to try extra hard to prove themselves. And I think that happens in any minority, right? So there are in various countries, people with a certain religion maybe have to prove extra hard that they are loyal to that country. There are people from a low caste who have to prove that we belong here not because of our quota, but because we deserve to be here because of our academic excellence. For a person with a disability, it's even more there because I think it's a financial burden on a family too if they have a child with a disability because there are extra medical costs, there might be extra caretaker costs, etc. But my message to persons with disabilities really is that do you want to go that extra? And I'm sure there will be people with disabilities who are listening to this podcast, right? So my point to persons with disabilities, and on the other hand, is that do you really want to settle for a mediocre life, or do you want to go and push yourself hard and actually capture that extra mile? Of course, it is not fair that you're expected to do it, but I'm somebody who actually started looking at it in a competitive way and started flourishing in it. And I know many other people with disabilities who flourished because of that.
How would you say your experience of business school was, both in terms of how your peers or your teachers behaved with you, but also in terms of accessibility, like for the buildings?
So my school, I think one of the biggest problems with my school, I went to a school in Bombay first and then in Noida. Physically, in terms of infrastructure, my schools, both of them were not, at least my Noida school was very accessible in that sense. It was more of an attitudinal barrier of students and in some teachers. A lot of my teachers were good too, but there were some teachers who either sympathized with me, which is again bad, or they looked through me, which is bad too. I finished my school in 2005 and it was then time to apply to colleges. And actually speaking, something that you might not know, because I know this is not really there in my official profile that you've read through, etc., is that I studied in a private college for 2 years for a scrap of paper because most colleges in Delhi University were not really accessible. So I got admission into this private college, which I think was taking a shortcut in life in that sense. And my parents had to fight even to get me into that college. And to their horror, in 2007, I decided to quit that college and say, I don't want to go to this college anymore. I deserve the best of education. And I applied to Delhi University and I remember my St. Stephen's interview because the principal actually told me that, Nipun, we love your CV, we want you admitted, but the economics classroom has been on the first of 125 years and it cannot shift down for one person. And I said, no problem, I'll go up on floor every day. And I used to make people lift up my wheelchair. It was a physical risk to me. But I used to go up to the first floor every day. And I did that for 4 days. And eventually the college itself decided to shift the economics classroom down for me. And I think the lesson that I learned there was really that if you persist, you can really change attitudes of any institution towards you, even though that institution is older than the history of your own country in that sense, right? After that, I went to Delhi School of Economics. Delhi School of Economics was actually not very accessible. St. Stephen's, I think I had a lovely time once the college was shifted down. In Delhi School of Economics, in the economics department, there's only this one lecture theatre that is really accessible. And the college administration wasn't as cooperative as St. Stephen's in that sense because they forced me to take whatever subject which could be accommodated there rather than me choosing my own subjects.
So
Which
whichever classes were available.
exactly, and I wanted to study more developmental and more descriptive subjects, and I was forced to take up more mathematical subjects, which it just happened to be. Yeah. Talking about education institutions, I've also gone to ISB after that. I did an executive MBA there, and despite the fact that ISB is not really a governmental college in that sense, it is very accessible, and I think a lot of the newer private universities that are coming up, like I believe Ashoka has also done a few accessibility audits, etc., are looking at accessibility in that sense.
Is this happening because of laws or policies, or because people in general are becoming more sensitized, or a mix of both?
I think it's a mix of both. A lot, Delhi University, every college today, for example, not just Delhi University, every government college in this country today has to have an equal opportunity cell, right? As per the RPWD Act. That itself is the first step towards making a college accessible. I go to a lot of colleges and I speak there, I interact with students, faculties, and I've actually realized that the equal opportunity cell in the college almost becomes like an internal activist cell in that particular college. What has also happened now is that the 2016 Act, of course, has a reservation for persons with disabilities, but it started in 1995, right, in jobs. So a lot of the teachers and faculty members in colleges today who are persons with disabilities have started coming in from 1995 onwards. So they are in the system for around 20, 25 years, and they've reached a position where they can be decision makers and they can push towards making the college accessible. So that today's students have a better time than the time those teachers had when they were students in those colleges in the 80s and the 90s, I guess, because they became faculty after 95, right? Secondly, when it comes to private education institutions, what's also happening is that a lot of these private education institutions have collaborations with colleges or business schools abroad. And a lot of these international business schools, etc., have much higher standards in terms of accessibility guidelines. Of course, they are way more expensive than than the public institutions. So, of course, affordability becomes another factor. But since you're talking about accessibility here, yeah, I think even the private universities are doing a lot now.
Since we're on the topic of governmental policies, what are your opinions on existing policies on disability? For instance, the UDID, the National Database for PWDs, the PWD Act.
Wow, I think it'll be better if we go one by one. Yeah, you asked me 4 questions together. So,
Okay, sure, please.
okay, so let's talk about the UDID first, right? Since you mentioned the UDID, I think the UDID is an interesting concept, and I use the word interesting because I think it's come up with the right intentions. And there are some people in the ministry who are really driving it now. I think it was really slow to start with, where only a handful of people, even in Delhi, got the UDID in a year's time. But now the numbers have started improving, and persons with disability have started getting the UDID card. But at the same time, I don't understand the logic behind the UDID card, to be very honest. Firstly, because UDID card was supposed to be a card that replaces everything else as a person with a disability. But the railway still insists on a separate railway concession card for persons with disabilities. You still need to have a disability certificate that leads to UDID. You still need an Aadhaar card because UDID will not really replace your Aadhaar card. And I think it's become fashionable these days for every government that comes into power to add more and more degrees and certificates that somebody really needs. For example, now I'm sure NRC and CA are going to lead to some citizenship certificate too. So, and in today's digital age, you really need so many cards and certificates. Why can't the Aadhaar card just cover everything? Is my personal opinion, you know. And I think it would have been much easier if the Aadhaar.
That was the purpose of the Aadhaar card in itself, was to be one sort of document
That includes everything. And I think it's a financial cost to the Ministry of Social Justice or the UDID card. That money could have really been spent more on accessibility or on better policies or whatever. If you do have to implement it, you should implement it well. And I am glad that over the last 3-4 months, they've increased the pace at which UDID cards are given.
And how do you think, whether it's the PWD Act 2016 or the national database that has been conceived as a result of it, or other.
The national database is a result of the UDID card, right? Is what they're making. Yeah. As far as the PWD Act 2016 is concerned, I think it was a very good and progressive act. And I think the one credit that I will give to this government is that they came up with the PWD Act. Of course, the PWD Act has shortcomings. No act is perfect, but that's the restriction that you face in a legislative democracy, where you cannot really keep hoping for an ideal act. At some point, you have to push the government really to implement and table the act, right? India signed the UNCRPD in 2007. After that, the previous government wasted 7 years doing nothing with the act. And in 2016, this act actually came into power. And so I think the one thing I would give this government full credit for is that they at least finally decided to come up with a progressive act, which was way better than the 1995 act. But the problem starts as soon as I compliment the government on coming up with this act and tabling it in parliament and having it passed. Because I think the implementation of this act has been very poor. There are a lot of provisions in this act that said within 5 to 6 years, everything will be made accessible. We haven't really seen much in that sense. This act is weak in terms of its discrimination clauses. If you look at section 3.3.
But what is the purpose exactly of having this national database for PWD?
The national database, the UDID card has been basically built that it's supposed to be that one card that is a connect for all welfare schemes and all that jazz which the government introduces in that sense. But the problem is that all the welfare schemes are linked to some ministry or the other, right? Ministry of Social Justice acts more like a nodal ministry. And no other ministries are really accepting this. So it's the bureaucracy between ministries that has really got it stuck in that sense. But yeah, I was talking about discrimination. Like, for example, discrimination is something that has been left as a loophole. States have been very slow in implementing rules for the PWD Act. And also, second, there's not been any consistency in terms of policy implementation with respect to the PWD Act. And I'm going to give you an example of that. For example, the PWD Act, in its accessibility section, talks about whenever any building is given a completion certificate, it should
Right.
follow the harmonized guidelines issued by the Ministry of Urban Development, the harmonized guidelines which were issued in 2016. Not a single state, irrespective of which political ideology it belongs to, whether it's a BJP state, a Congress state, an AAP state, a regional party state, not a single state has so far changed the building bylaws to include the harmonized guidelines.
Okay.
So today you can actually get away by creating a building which is not accessible at all, getting a completion certificate because the PWD official will come, will only look at the building bylaws, and the building bylaws don't even mention accessibility. So this act has just become an act which is kind of spineless in that sense, because there are a lot of other laws that need to be brought on.
And they don't.
For example, this act talks about, I'll give you another example, just talking about examples. And in fact, I'm filing a PIL on this, that this act actually talks about how all content has to be made accessible for persons with disabilities. How do you make content accessible for blind people? It's from audio descriptions.
Right.
But the Central Bureau of Film Certification, over the last 4 years, I have filed multiple RTIs, there are others who've been fighting about it, has not really done much to ensure that movie producers for a movie above a certain budget should release audio descriptions along with the movie.
Right.
So these are just two examples, but I think these two examples kind of explain the challenges in the implementation of the PWD Act.
Right. On the topic of PILs, we do know that you have filed quite a few PILs with the Supreme and High Courts. Can you tell us how the judicial system accommodates you as a person with disability? Whether also in terms of accessibility, in terms of is there any discrimination that happens at the level of the judiciary against persons with disability?
I don't think there's any discrimination as such that happens in the judiciary with respect to persons with disabilities. Of course, accessibility to courts is a challenge, both for persons with disabilities and people without disabilities. For persons with disabilities, it becomes more exaggerated because it's not just the financial cost, but it's also the physical accessibility cost, right? A lot of courts are old heritage buildings which are not really physically accessible to persons with disabilities. And in fact, I've had the pleasure of doing accessibility audits of a few courts, so I actually know the kind of challenges persons with disabilities face while accessing courts. And what people don't realize is that it's not just that the courtroom that has to be made accessible, but there's a lot that goes on, right? The place where you file your case, the place where you have to get your form made when you are entering court, etc. So every point of contact where a petitioner or a lawyer has to interact with the court should be made accessible. You cannot just look at one thing and say that it's accessible. Though a lot of courts in India feel that a court accessible, a courtroom, so we are accessible. Judges don't realize that there's a lot more that goes on into it. As far as getting justice is concerned, I think persons with disabilities don't face any specific challenge which is more or less compared to others, because we face the same challenge that any other petitioner faces, which is it's of course a roster of judges. Some are more pro-disability, some are less pro-disability, just like for any other cause in that sense. The Indian judiciary is time consuming and it's time consuming for whether you're disabled or you're not disabled. So I don't think there's anything specific in that sense.
Right. So let's circle back a little bit. Let's talk about what drove you to become an activist. Was it a particular instance? Was it an incident? And what role does your disability have in your life as an activist?
No, I think it's definitely my own life that impacted me to become an activist. I am not somebody who at the age of 10 said that went and told my parents, oh, मेरे को activist बनना है, मुझे person with disabilities से fight करना है. It's not that kind of a story. I mean, when I was 10, in fact, I wanted to be a cricket commentator. I loved cricket, and Harsha Bhogle was my pen friend, and I thought that I want to become India's next Harsha Bhogle because otherwise I can't play cricket, but I can commentate on cricket. But when I was in Delhi School of Economics, I actually decided to sit for placements, and when I sat for placements, I saw the discrimination persons with disabilities faced firsthand. Including being rejected by a company because they wanted to test whether I can sit on a wheelchair for 8 hours a day, which I thought was bizarre because I've gone to an ordinary school, I've gone to a mainstream college, I'm doing my masters. Another who said that we don't believe that these are academic qualifications. So we want a letter from your principal in St. Stephens and a letter from your department head in D school saying that you are actually doing all this and you're not forging your CV or whatever, which is again humiliating, and I walked off. A third that made me go through 7 rounds of interviews and then eventually said we don't have a disabled-friendly toilet, so it's better not to hire you. And when I told them that I can control my bladder and I'm used to it, they said, no, you might sue us tomorrow, so it's just safer not to hire you. And I had not even thought of suing anybody at that time. Since then, I've sued a lot of people, of course. But yeah, those things kept happening, and I was disappointed, I was dejected, but I think that eventually pushed me to do what I'm doing.
So, in your opinion, in India, when we talk about disability, whether it's in terms of advocacy, accessibility, sensitization, and so on, do you think people take into account the diversity that just the term disability encompasses? Do you think that is something that we have started taking into account, or we're still sort of we have?
I think if you look at India's Disabilities Act, both the act that came up in 1995 and the act that came up in 2016, they actually list down 7
Yes,
disabilities in that
yes,
case and
yes.
21 in this case. If you are this, or this, you are disabled.
Right.
Which itself is restricting disability, right? I mean, if you look at a lot of the more Western or developed countries, there's no blanket definition of disability, but they look at the social model of disability, where disability is any barrier that exists in society that prevents the full inclusion of a person in society, and that's why the onus is more on society.
Right.
I think India's gone from the moved away from the charity model of disability, and thank God for that. But we've moved towards a medical model of disability, where we're still restricting disability according to certain brackets. So when we're only looking at those 21 disabilities, now when you go down further, when you look at quotas in jobs, you further reduce the number of disabilities, because I was actually reading somewhere that some disabilities like hemophilia, etc., are not even recognized amongst the disabilities that, even though they are there in the PWD Act 2016, they are not recognized while during the 4% quota for jobs. Then further down, when you go in for accessibility audits, most people don't even know what an access audit is.
Yeah.
So when you talk about a ramp, yes, they'll know that if you make a ramp, the building will be made accessible. But even a ramp, they won't know that the ramp has to be of the ratio of 1:12.
Okay.
They'll just think that ramp बनाना एक formality है, बनाओ तो ramp तो बना दिया, हमने अपना काम कर दिया in that sense.
Okay.
So I completely agree with you, but I think the problem starts much earlier in terms of framing the law itself.
Yeah.
And even though I complimented the government for the RPWD Act 2016, and I continue to compliment the government, because I think change is never really drastic, right? You don't move from A to Z, you move from A to B to C. And I think I understand that. So the 2016 Act is way, way better than the 95 Act. But this is, I think, something that it gets wrong.
Yeah, it does. It does when it comes to listing the number of
exactly.
It does. It has its shortcomings.
Even societal progress leads to a lot of temporary disabilities, etc. Because there are a lot of disabilities that are coming up because of the way people are sitting in front of the computer every day, neck problems, etc. So I think societal changes lead to a lot of
especially in terms of poverty and all.
And even the coronavirus is not a disability; it's a virus. But that's just an example about how a society is moving forward. There are various new problems that keep coming up. So do you want to sit with a law which was made in a particular year and it defined disability, or do you want to have something which is flexible enough to include anything that over time comes up?
So, if we can get back to you on a personal level, how do you negotiate your individuality in an ideological space that is constantly trying to put you in a mold? Like, you're a person with disability, and that comes with a set of ideas, but you're still an individual. So, how do you negotiate that?
No, I think that's an interesting question. I've not been asked this question very often, so I'm glad you have actually asked me this question. But I think when you look at any individual, they are way beyond just any one thing, right? I think everybody is a complete human being and a complete individual, and that's why it's a person first before a disability. And I think I'm somebody who's been lucky to have had both family and friends with whom I don't even discuss my disability. Like, for example, a lot of my friends, they tell me that when we are having dinner with you and we're chatting and we're sitting with a glass of wine or whatever, we don't even realize that you are a person with a disability, because that's I think sometimes both persons with disabilities and their own families to get into this sympathy trap, where they start thinking about the disability all the time. But for me, my disability is just another identity, just like, for example, that I'm an Indian, or the fact that I'm a resident of Delhi NCR.
So, Nipun, you've worked with a lot of different kinds of organizations, structurally, that have ranged from corporations to startups, NGOs, etc. What are your opinions on the startup culture of India in terms of, say, giving opportunities to PWDs, in terms of the activism space? Have you noticed a difference, if at all? Would you like to comment on that?
I don't know what you exactly mean by the startup culture in India giving opportunities to persons with disabilities, because the definition of startup also in India keeps changing in that sense. But I think there are some industries that have really led the way in terms of giving opportunities to persons with disabilities. The tech industry is one of them. A lot of technology companies are focusing more both on persons with disabilities as customers and as employees. So they're making the products and technologies accessible. They're also ensuring that they're hiring persons with disabilities. The hospitality industry is another industry that has hired a lot of persons with disabilities. They're a big employer of persons with disabilities because they also realize that hiring persons with disabilities makes customers feel that there's a larger purpose with this particular institution, and that's why they're employing many more persons with disabilities. As far as the startup culture is concerned, actually there are a lot of startups that are now coming up that are actually especially catering to persons with disabilities. There are a couple of travel companies that have come up that are planning holidays for persons with disabilities and the elderly. There are a lot of software companies that are specifically making softwares for people with both learning and intellectual disabilities. A lot is happening in the education space in that sense. So yeah, there are a lot of startups catering to persons with disabilities in that sense, and I think that is great because persons with disabilities can be a big customer to anything in that sense.
So Nipun, what are your future plans in the activism space? For instance, do you have any aspirations to work in the educational, vocational training sectors or PWDs? What is the way forward for you?
So I always believe that there are three challenges persons with disabilities face, and I like to call them the three A's, which are attitudes, accessibility, and affordability. So I think removing all these barriers and trying my bit to reduce these three barriers of persons with disabilities is what I'm trying to do. And I think it doesn't necessarily have to be from the activism space. It could also be softer in that sense, right? Because for example, I came up with this video, and I'm sure your listeners can actually Google search it. If they search for Baba wheelchair Nipun, they'll find it on YouTube. It's actually a kind of a parody video trying to change attitudes towards persons with disabilities. So yeah, I think these are the three areas I want to work in. I would not like to bracket it into anything like educational or vocational training or anything, but anything that really serves the purpose of solving these three challenges that persons with disabilities face is how I'd like to spend my time.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.